Hi all. It is, of course, completely presumptuous of me to dare to write and broadcast a video.
Ooh, this is gonna be a painful one, isn't it? Alright, let's do this. Now, before we start, I have to call out a few people here, namely 2 of my followers who dared to enter into my secret den, also known as my Discord, and pestered me about videos. And so, this video is dedicated to you two. Minutes and minutes and minutes of pain from me to you for the crime of telling me that I'm lazy. Also, I'm not gonna film it because it's too damn long and we're too damn busy because it's Christmas, and also I'm lazy.
It is, of course, completely presumptuous of me to dare to write and broadcast a video entitled Message to the Christian Churches, but I'm going to do it anyway because I have something to say and because that something needs to be said.
Totally okay, that's what the internet is here for. However, the first part of this video is not really related to the actual point that we two are trying to get through, and so I'll just speed it up and link in the description to the original video. If you want to check it all out, you know where to find it.
I've been speaking to and watching and listening to audiences all over the Western world for the past 4 years, in person and in virtual form, and I've learned a few things in consequence. It all started in some sense with the lectures I did on Genesis in 2017. My family and I took a risk and rented out a theater in Toronto on the off chance that there might be an audience for what might be described as a psychological approach to our ancient stories. And lo and behold, and miracle of miracles, there was. I completed 15 or so lectures walking through the first biblical book, sold out the theater, and attracted, surprisingly, millions of viewers, Christians, Jews, Muslims, and atheists.
Is it unexpected though? I mean, one of the few things that made you quite known to an awful lot of people was your vocal disagreement with Bill C-16 and the viral university campus video, which of course got a lot of attention, and these Bible seminars were shortly after, so I wouldn't be surprised if there were some curious viewers popping up. On top of that, you already had a decent following, which of course is not sufficient. A person from Texas, for example, wouldn't necessarily fly to Toronto to watch you. But before the viral video, many viewers might have been people who knew you already, such as students, clients, friends, possibly just like-minded people who happen to live locally. And I don't know, maybe the number itself is very high compared to what you were expecting, but you are not a no-name person. I would expect some people at least to show up. I do get the point, however. Your speech must have had a ring to it, regardless of how well known you were. Because if you were famous and said you would make a 500-hour lecture about the chemical composition of slug mucus, there probably would be very, very few people actually showing up. Whereas if you said you would expose the deep secrets of Catholic copulation strategies hidden within the Pope's library, you probably would have a far, far bigger audience, because you would attract far, far more curious people.
And most of the people who attended live, and the majority of those who watched online, were young men. That is not a phenomenon that can be easily accounted for. But let me try.
I could point out that there always was a bit of a difference between guys and girls when talking about theological or generally philosophical debates or thought exchanges. In fact, I vaguely remember that there was a huge issue in the atheist movement because for some reason there were always far, far more guys than girls. And their sausage fest made them so extremely uncomfortable that they eventually started to try to force their own numbers. They tried to embrace every possible and impossible lunacy that could potentially change that. Whether that was atheism plus, rainbow atheism, or furry inclusive trans atheism. Eventually the community was so packed full with dogma and woo-woo that any self-respecting real atheist, me included, would stay far, far away from all this mess and just disinfect their eyes and ears whenever they saw or heard of it. All I'm saying, Dr. PT, is that unless you were giving out free makeup, I would have expected that sort of lecture to be male dominant. And yes, young male dominant, because older guys tend to have families and jobs and not a lot of time to go and listen to some guy talking about brain twirling. But all of that is a bit beside the point. What you said, and what I said is all pure speculation. And so to the audience, let me say this. Peterson here observed a phenomenon that he considers odd, or not quite in line with what he would expect, at least. And he is about to offer a hypothesis for his observation. In other words, it is his opinion, it is not a fact. And we have to keep that in mind. However, I will treat his perspective as accurate for the sake of argument.
Now, in the West, because of the weight of historical guilt that is upon us, a variant of the sense of original sin in a very real sense, and because of a very real attempt by those possessed by what might be described as unhelpful ideas to weaponize that guilt, our young people face a demoralization that is perhaps unparalleled. This is particularly true of young men.
There is a lot to unpack here. First off, what exactly is meant with historical guilt, and why equated with the original sin? Well, the answer is rather intuitive, even if not really pleasant, and to unpack it I will have to refer to a very intriguing phenomenon. In many countries, historical atrocities are either ignored or denied or simply forgotten, whereas in other countries, they tend to be kept in the mind of people. And even many generations later, these people are required or wanting to feel guilty about what happened in the past, what their ancestors did. For example, Germany's treatment of the Holocaust is one of explicit mea culpa. The people tend to feel remorses of the past, be ashamed of it, and so on. Germany holds itself accountable, and other nations expect it to hold itself accountable. And you see a very similar approach in Canada with its First Nations. And an oddly growing sentiment very similar to this down in the US, where formerly honored personalities have become synonymous with villains because of their, back then, common practice of, for example, slavery. To the contrary, a country such as Turkey, to this day, does not acknowledge the Armenian genocide. Nor would other nations necessarily tend to hold Turkey accountable for it. Or, another example would be China, which refuses to acknowledge its abusive treatment to the Tibetan or Uyghur population, never mind feeling guilty about it, and even if once in a while a country or a person denounces them for their treatment of these minorities, there is no serious international push to have China admit to it, never mind stop it, and even less apologize for it in a similar vein as Germany did. And even if such a push existed, no one would seriously expect China to actually do it. Unfortunately, the why for this phenomenon is not really some black and white peer-reviewed research paper. There are several good hypotheses for this. For example, there could be power involved or, special interests of wealthier people who are in charge. But the only actual proven fact is that we can see a discrepancy between countries and people and especially cultures. However, whether by design or by accident, Peterson nudges a hypothesis that holds an awful lot of water in this regard. And he does so by uttering the word original sin. Why? Well, because this mea culpa phenomenon is extremely prevalent in countries that are predominantly Christian, but is suspiciously absent in most countries that are not. And so the hypothesis goes somewhat like this. A Christianity-based society is prone to project the teachings of original sin onto its own historical occurrences. In other words, Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit and sinned, therefore I'm sinful. The people who lived in this country before I did horrible thing X, therefore I am guilty of X. And I want you to keep this hypothesis in mind as we go through the rest of the video. The second part I would like to focus on is this.
And because of a very real attempt by those possessed by what might be described as unhelpful ideas to weaponize that guilt, our young people face a demoralization that is perhaps unparalleled. This is particularly true of young men.
Very interesting way of phrasing it. Unhelpful ideas. Peterson also doesn't specify who he is, in a roundabout way, accusing of abusing this obvious mea culpa thought process. This brain software vulnerability, if you wish. Those who follow him are perfectly aware of what he's talking about, obviously. And those who don't, aren't. And I think that that is partially the point. I would, however, like to point out a very little curiosity that just couldn't escape my mind. Peterson claims that our young people are demoralized, meaning all young people, not just men. Which obviously begs the question, why would predominantly young men show up and not all young people, if the demoralization is overreaching? He then, of course, specifies that it is particularly true for young men, but he never truly explains or hypothesizes if this is actually the case or why it would be the case. And, more importantly, why that would lead to the outcome of having all of these young men show up at lectures about God, of all things.
Our young people face a demoralization that is perhaps unparalleled. This is particularly true of young men, although anything that devastates young men will eventually do the same to young women.
And the other way around. That is correct. The explanation for this is very obvious. We live in a society where what we do has an impact on our surroundings. If you demoralize a huge chunk of the population, be it male or female, everyone that is adjacent to that population will have an impact. The future spouse, the sons, the daughters, the friends, sometimes even the parents and the siblings. However, the crux in this case is the number. For example, if one guy becomes a drunkard, he has an impact on his family and his broader social circle, which is sad, but an isolated case. If suddenly a huge subset of the population gets addicted to alcohol, then that has a major impact on the future of that society because so many more people are involved in it and so many more people are affected by it. So far so good? Let us see where he goes from there.
And that, in this era of anti-natalism and equally reprehensible nihilism, is precisely the point.
The point is to demoralize people in an era of anti-natalism, you say. Well, first of all, let us try to decide what should or shouldn't count as anti-natalism. Because the way we define it will inform the way we talk about it, obviously. Unfortunately, Peterson doesn't define it for us, so we kinda have to puzzle it together for ourselves. When I hear anti-natalism, the first thing that jumps to my mind is the China one-child policy, where from the 1970s-ish to 2015, the state demanded that you have only one child, and if you had more, you would get either fined, or in some cases forcibly sterilized, or many other things like that. And that to me is a very clear case of anti-natalism, state-enforced anti-natalism, in fact. However, anti-natalism doesn't necessarily have to be obligatory in order to exist. There are, for example, groups out there who explicitly decide not to have children in an attempt to reduce the threat of climate change. A sort of self-sacrificial act in the name of their belief, if you will. Would that count as anti-natalism? Yes, because it does reduce the potential number of people, deliberately. And if we were to grant it to that, should we grant it to other movements too? For example, there has been in recent years more focus on different lifestyles, such as the gay movement, pride parades, trans issues, and the ability for some women to end unwanted pregnancies later and later in the process. All of these ideas and occurrences tend to decrease the number of children, because they tend to promote lifestyles that either make it easier to not get children or harder to get children, for various reasons, obviously. And keep in mind that none of what I just said is a moral judgment. Regardless of whether you believe that these lifestyle choices are good or bad, their effect is what it is. And thus people can and will classify them as anti-natalism. And I think that in order to establish that, we might find it helpful to look at a different kind of example. There are a decent number of people in the US who advocate against contraceptives, for less abortions, for traditional marriage, and so on. And they happen to have a lot of impact, similar to the pro-abortion movement. If we consider this a natalist movement, i.e. a movement whose goal it is to increase the number of births, then we have to consider the others an anti-natalist movement, i.e. a movement whose goal it is to reduce the number of births, even if it is indirectly. Whether you consider some of it natalist and anti-natalist and some of it not, or none of it anti-natalist and natalist, or all of it, that is a matter of your own perspective, and it is beside the point. What matters is that we all understand that the same way one can consider and see the anti-abortion crowd as a threat that forces people to have kids, and thus a hostile natalist movement, the other side can see the pro-abortion crowd as a threat that kills babies and thus is a hostile anti-natalist movement. Alright, with that said, let us go back to Peterson. He clearly views the current movements, or at least part of them, as anti-natalist and harmful. Now, I might not have exactly caught the gist of his sentiment, because he doesn't share it, but I hope I have still meant him enough, to the best of my abilities at least. It is not really my position to argue with his opinion. He has his, you have yours, I have mine, and that is not what we are here for. What matters in this regard is simply that we understand his perspective and what he tries to convey. And it matters because if we take his opinion as an absolute fact and run with it, I noticed a bit of an issue. Because it is true that there are less children being born, it is true that in the West especially, we can see problems of demoralization. However, he conjoined the two and implied that one is the result of the other, or rather, that one is deliberate and meant to cause the other.
And that, in this era of anti-natalism and equally reprehensible nihilism, is precisely the point.
Now, this claim here is a bit of a reality claim. A claim that one could be able to prove and would have to prove. Unless you believe that everyone's feelings are their own reality, in which case Peterson's reality is totally real. End of story, and you can't question it because he's standing and brave and the video is over. Seriously though, such a claim has to be proven in order for me to believe it. But Peterson in this particular video is not in the business to prove or to convince me. He's in the business of sharing his own opinion with predominantly like-minded people who already believe what he believes. And so I have to find out for myself what to make of his claim. Is demoralization the point of antinatalism? Is that really true? Well, there are many ways to find out. For example, we could see if there is population decrease in the Western countries only. If they are connected time-wise, perhaps, with certain changes in society. Or if there are common correlations. And there are countless other little things that might or might not be useful to help us solve this puzzle. We will look at a few of those things later on. But before we do any of this, I would like to remind you that this is a hypothesis. And I would like to compare it to an alternative hypothesis. There is a book called Countdown from the researcher Shanna H. Swan, in which she points out in detail how certain substances that are present in different kinds of plastics, commonly used in containers and food packaging, among other things, can leak into the food. And that these leaked substances have a direct impact on the development of fetuses in the womb, and to a lesser but still significant extent on the people outside the womb. The effects can cause hormonal imbalance. For example, they might increase the estrogen level in men or the testosterone level in women, depending of course on what plastic we're talking about. But the predominant worry of Shanna H. Swan was the continued reduction in male fertility that she linked to these plastics. The book points out that the more these substances leak into the food, especially during pregnancy, the less capable the offspring is to reproduce. So the same way that I could say anti-natalism propaganda and acceptance of these new lifestyles is meant to lead to a demoralized population, I could also say harmful substances lead to a hormonal change that causes infertility and sexual confusion, and the demoralization caused by it creates a coping mechanism of lifestyle changes and anti-natalism. In other words, you could swap the two and still make a good argument for them. And regardless of how plausible you may find either hypothesis, both have to be further examined and either proven or disproven. And until then, they can't be discarded because they haven't been disproven, but they also can't be taken for granted because they have not been proven. And even if I were to grant Peterson's hypothesis, I would still argue that that sort of propaganda wouldn't make much of a dent, considering that we have one giant elephant in the room that needs to be addressed. Well, two actually. But let's start with the most obvious. Whether or not one believes that we are in an era of anti-natalism, that doesn't change the fact that children are expensive and hard to raise properly. Especially in a time where many of us are stuck in a glorified tin can in a city rather than on a farm on a nice big patch of land where the kids could run around, play around, and maybe learn about the world while helping out the parents as they work the farm. And the cost of living in the West has been consistently going up the last few years, with no much end in sight. Inflation, unfortunately, is a thing worth keeping in mind when deciding to get kids or not. And one that, quite frankly, could start a massive demoralization wave all by itself. So, if we cannot assume that the tight or even manageable current state will get any better anytime soon, and that we already have a suboptimal lifestyle for proper development for children, then under such circumstances, it is very easy to understand that many decide not to have children at all. Anti-natalism or not. And the second elephant is that many people who were raised in North America or increasingly in Western Europe often lack the skills and time to build and maintain solid relationships in the first place. And it is an increasingly perpetuating cycle too. Whether children are in a daycare, where the caretaker often has way too many kids and thus merely ensures that they stay alive rather than thoroughly taking care of them, or they have parents who are too busy, too tired, or otherwise unable to establish a deeper connection, the effect is the same. Kids are often on their own, trained to be self-reliant, and struggle to figure out how to tie proper bonds with other people. And the media is not very helpful either, because it delivers very, very shallow and very skewed, if not completely unrealistic, ideas of how relationships are formed or maintained. We know that children raised by abusive parents will have a great chance to either abuse their children or inadvertently seek out abusive partners. And while that is not true for every child coming from an abusive relationship, it still shows a predominant trend. And the same principle applies to this. Kids who had no parental guidance have a very hard time to pass that parental guidance on to their children. If you have no grasp of what a deep bond is supposed to look like and how to handle conflicts or disagreements accordingly, then you will struggle to upkeep or even create a proper relationship in the first place. On top of that, we had several years of social distancing in which it was near impossible to get any sort of bonding experience with friends, mates or colleagues or other people who would in other cases have compensated for the parents. And as if that is not enough, we have a giant subset of the population that has not learned how to interpret or handle temporary discomfort, such as sadness, distress, confusion, or other signals that the body sends out when things are going wrong. In a robust society setting, this kind of emotional signals would have been picked up by friends or family members who would then have offered guidance or support and showed people how to deal with it. However, what we have instead is that people learned to numb their feelings and absolutely ignore them. Rather than dealing with their problems, they artificially increase their mood through medication, TV, video games, fast food, and other sources of quick dopamine release. And while these kind of things can offer temporary relief, they will also not deal with the problem that causes this discomfort in the first place. And if people do not deal with it, they have no way to recover from it or to get rid of it. And all of these things together gather up in a massive shit show, quite frankly. You cannot maintain a relationship if you don't even know how the hell to start one, or how exactly to interact with that weird, creepy other human being over there that you kinda really like but you kinda also really fear, or how to interpret or respond to emotional signals sent by this weird other person. And even if you managed, you would still have to find a significant other who at least in part understands how to interact with other people too. You can also not maintain a relationship if the world revolves around you alone, or around your partner alone, or if in spite of you both being absolute sweethearts, the two of you are so damn scared of each other or to mess things up that you treat each other with absolute care and kid gloves and become increasingly lonely in spite of sleeping right next to each other. And that massive uphill battle, that is just the easy part. Now imagine adding a baby to the mix. A 24/7 commitment that disrupts any resemblance of routine, reduces the amount of sleep to a fraction of what you needed, and puts even more strain on a relationship that was a glorified Frankenstein patchwork in the first place. And that dysfunctional mess of a relationship then gets studied and picked up by the kids, who will end up in the very same predicament a few decades down the line. It is absolutely clear that things such as family are a very, very big commitment that can bring a lot of joy, but also require a lot of work. But in spite of that, what we see time and time again in many places in North America and increasingly in Europe is that people are encouraged to see family as a secondary thing at best, a sort of pet project alongside work if you will, or at worst an everlasting chore that makes everyone miserable, poor and divorced. Because time and time again, that's what people see. And let us look at the social and emotional aspect of it for a second. What is the promise for such a lifestyle? What do people get from society if they choose it? How many people are famous for being parents and homemakers, for example, rather than CEOs? How many people were famous for being parents and homemakers in the past? How are people supposed to raise a healthy and well-adjusted child if we demand that they don't get to see them because they're stuck at work all the time? And who exactly is thanking these people for reducing their income and taking the time to raise their kids, if they do? It's not the work givers, it's not the politicians, and it's not the rest of society either most of the time, even though all of them benefit from it. In fact, sometimes it's not even their own partners. I am really sorry, Dr. Pete, but if people want to bemoan this as an era of anti-natalism, then perhaps, just perhaps, they should look at themselves, and I mean really, really look at themselves, and search their own mind on what they're actually doing to change the current status quo. Because sitting around lazily, complaining into a camera and pointing fingers at others is certainly not the solution. Well, we're barely a few seconds into the original video and we are already close to half an hour of me ranting like a lunatic. Alright, how about I cut the video here and save the rest of the rant for another time and try to save my voice. And I can promise you that it gets increasingly weird, both me and him. And once we get to the end, you will see just why this particular video took me so damn long to digest and to respond to. Until then, I hope you have a wonderful evening, and in case we don't see each other, a wonderful Christmas and a Happy New Year. Mwah!